MSNBC's Yasmin Vasugian in Santa Fe, MSNBC legal analyst Danny Savalas, Jeff Harris, a partner at Harris, Lowry and Manton, who has had a background in high-profile cases of fatalities on sets, and movie industry armorer Clay Van Sickle. Welcome all. Well, first of all, Danny Savalas, let's go through a couple of things that we now heard. There was a lead projectile or a bullet that was recovered from the director's shoulder. The sheriff said he believes, apparently, that this is the same projectile that killed Helena Hutchins, the rising star in the film industry, the chief victim here. He said that there were live rounds, that was a live round, and that there were other live rounds found among 500 rounds of ammo, including dummy rounds, as part of that, all recovered from the set, that they've recovered the firearm that they believe fired the projectile, and that evidence is being forwarded to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, for further analysis. No charges at this time. Too early to say whether any charges would be filed. What am I leaving out here, and what is the significance of what he said today?
The significance is that the sheriff here is clearly playing this very close to his vest. He's doing this in a very conservative way. You saw him really only concede that, look, we only know there was one live round because there was a fatality. As to all the other 500, and that number 500 is very significant, the 500 other pieces of ammunition that they recovered, he will not opine on those because he's waiting until the tests come back from Quantico. You would not expect him to test those rounds by just shooting them into the air. He's going to wait until the tests come back. But I think if you read between the lines of his answers, it will be very significant in his analysis how many of those rounds found on set were actual live ammunition as opposed to dummy rounds and blanks. I think that will factor heavily into the analysis.
Jeff Harris, we also heard him talk about complacency on this movie set. That was an opinion, but he talked about complacency, and obviously the questions here are we talking about civil suits against the company, potentially the producer? One of the producers, of course, is Alec Baldwin, or we're talking about criminal negligence here?
Well, if you look at what the sheriff said, I don't think there's any way to look at it without coming to the conclusion that there had to have been a systemic failure on the part of the production itself from the top all the way down in failing to follow very basic safety policies. The fact that you would have one live round intermingled with potentially dummy rounds and blanks on a movie set is inexplicable, and there's no way to look at something like that without concluding that someone was negligent, and I believe grossly negligent. The distinction between the two is in the civil case, the question is whether or not people were acting reasonably on the movie set, and in a criminal case, it has to be gross negligence. I don't think there's any doubt that someone was grossly negligent by allowing a live round onto a movie set, allowing that live round to get into a firearm and handing that firearm to an actor.
And Clay Van Sickle, what the sheriff said was that the three principals who were involved with the director, the armorer, Hannah Gutierrez, and obviously Alec Baldwin have all been cooperating. They've all been interviewed. They've had depositions. But let's talk about that armorer, because that's something you know so much about. Certainly, she was relatively inexperienced. She was just 24 years old. What red flags stood out from you following the revelations today?
The fact that she alone was so inexperienced and so unqualified, apparently, this being only her second film as an armorer, is a huge red flag. Qualifications, experience, let me say that again, experience is the biggest safety factor an armorer has, to know what's going to happen before it happens, and to know all the protocols and the safety systems for years. We fired millions and millions of blank rounds safely on set, and if the protocols are followed, accidents like this cannot happen.
Yasmin, you have been out there covering this, but you and I have covered so many stories over the years, concerns about the safety on movie sets, but this just stands out. You've got, a superstar in Alec Baldwin, but he's also highly politicized, so he's going to get hits from one part of the country because he was so well identified with, all of his opposition and portrayal and satirization of Donald Trump, but also the fact that he's a producer, an actor. Clearly, some of the protocols, the normal protocols, were not followed about live ammo on a set.
Clearly, Andrea, and I got to say, having followed this story as it's unfolded over the last week or so, I'm actually quite surprised the investigation is not further along than it is. We still have a lot of questions out there and not necessarily a lot of answers. I mean, even hearing from the sheriff not necessarily wanting to say, yes, in fact, this was a live round. I suspect it was a live round, but the breaking news is, yes, in fact, it was a live round, wanting to get the full and complete investigation to make sure that he doesn't overstep, I should say. But nonetheless, I think it's surprising to hear that it was a live round and that other live rounds were in fact found on the set. Hearing from the district attorney saying everything is still on the table. This is something that she has been consistent with from the beginning, but this is going to be a long, painstaking investigation, considering the folks that are involved in this investigation, Andrea, as you mentioned. There's so many people that were on that set that day, so many of the witnesses that saw what took place that day, and the way those events unfolded. You speak about the armorer, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, only 24 years old, as you mentioned. Only the second time she was the head armorer on a movie set. That is obviously coming into question. There were only 3 individuals that handled these guns on set. It was Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, the armorer, who put those guns on that cart, right? It was David Halls, the assistant director, who actually had been fired from another movie set back in 2019 because of negligent handling of a firearm. And then it was subsequently Alec Baldwin who fired that gun, killing Helena Hutchins. So still a lot of questions, not a lot of answers, and this thing will likely go on for weeks until we can get some of those answers, Andrea.
Indeed. And Danny, I thought that, you mentioned that the sheriff was being very conservative. I can understand him not wanting to prejudice a case. The DA as well. Obviously, anything they say now could, affect the evidence as they go forward. But he was willing to say he thought that there had been complacency on the set. Thought that was interesting. But tell me something else that I may have missed in the way they're approaching this.
It was very interesting, and the question that elicited that response was a very well-crafted question. I can't recall it, but you saw a rare crack in the conservative armor of the sheriff and the district attorney here, where he essentially concedes that there was complacency. Now, complacency is not a legal standard. It doesn't necessarily rise to the level of negligence, but it's a good starting point. And so if the sheriff is starting at the place of complacency, then in his mind, he's thinking there are people who may have been negligent. But the lesson we learned from the Brandon Lee tragedy of 1993, where Brandon Lee was killed on set in a somewhat similar incident, is that even if there were many different pieces of negligence by many different people on set, that may not rise to the level of criminal negligence, which is really a recklessness standard. The inquiry is whether or not they consciously disregarded a known risk. And there were no charges in the Brandon Lee investigation, so that's something to keep in mind, that investigators can conclude negligence, which will give rise to a massive civil lawsuit, but it may not rise to the level of criminality.
It has to be gross negligence, is what they said. Clay, I want to ask you about the armorer's role. Now, how much training do actors get? How much would Alec Baldwin have been told about how to handle the weapon? And how much practice would they do? And presumably the practice, it's supposed to be with blanks. So the big mystery, of course, is how live ammo got in there. But just how unusual would this be? How well would he have been trained? We don't know how much experience Mr. Baldwin had in Westerns and in anything that might involve using a weapon.
From the training aspect, that'll depend on the show. If the show has enough time and money to get talent trained specifically on the weapons or the techniques that they're going to be using. If, for instance, an actor is playing a SWAT team member, they might go and train with actual SWAT officers. Someone with Mr. Baldwin's career behind him, he's got tons of experience with weapons. And I think throwing any blame at Mr. Baldwin, the actor, is rather premature, as he was trusting the system that has been in place for a very long time, that the armorer and the first AD, who are the safety officers when it comes to weapons on sets, have done their job. Clearly, that did not happen. I have no idea why an AD would be touching a weapon at all, let alone handing one to an actor and declaring it cold when it clearly was not, and he clearly did not check it and confirm that it was cold.
And we've seen that kind of check. I saw a demonstration in another story on NBC where, and I think we played it yesterday, in fact, on this program with Miguel Almaguer, showing that, it's only a few seconds to just go through the rounds and make sure that that gun is safe.
Right. It's literally this. That's all the time it takes.
And Alec Baldwin has had, no comment, is not commenting at all on this briefing. And it's just a tragedy for everyone, but obviously, overwhelmingly for Helena Hutchins, her family, her son, for everyone involved in her, in their lives. But it's a tragedy for anyone involved in this kind of fatal accident. You can only imagine what they are going through as well. Well, thank you all so much for your expertise, to Clay and Danny and Jeff Harris. And I guess, Jeff Harris, one final question would be, what would you as a lawyer be doing, a plaintiff's lawyer, right now?
Well, you want to start investigating this from the top down. And the thing that I haven't really heard a whole lot about that I'm really interested in is who made the hiring decisions. There's been some speculation that Alec Baldwin might be liable because he's a producer. The fact that he's a producer is sort of meaningless in the movie business because you have active producers and you have passive producers. But I want to know who made the decision to hire an armorer who was clearly unqualified, who made the decision to hire a first AD who had obviously some stuff in his background that should have raised a red flag, and who was in charge of the culture of safety or lack thereof on this set. I want to know who in the hierarchy of this production made some what turns out to be tragic decisions that resulted in this incident.
Well, thank you for that, Jeff, and thanks again to Clay and to Yasmin, of course, and Danny, to all of you for all your help today. This tragedy continues.